Mortality is the only absolute law in the galaxy. Everything else is merely a negotiation. In the suffocating hierarchy of the Imperium of Man, the common soul is a slave to a predetermined fate. But there exists a sovereign myth whispered in the shadowed spires of the nobility, a promise of an unchained illusion known as the Warrant of Trade. Observe the rogue trader, a man granted the divine right to sail past the Emperor's light into the terrifying expanse of Warhammer 40,000. Most see a liberator. A cold academic eye sees only a masterfully engineered gilded confinement. Today, we dissect the birth of a king who never truly found his throne. We witness the exact moment when the dream of independence was murdered by a signature. Because when a master grants a slave his path, it is not a path of freedom. It is a path of deployment. Observe the nature of the human mind when it is cornered by the inevitable. To understand the tragic anatomy of the rogue king, one must first perceive the toxic environment that birthed his ambition. The story does not begin among the stars, but beneath the crushing atmospheric weight of Holy Terra. The throne world is not a cradle of life. It is a sprawling Gothic ossuary of 1 billion martyrs. The air is a thick chemical soup, heavy with the scent of ancient incense and the ash of cremated generations. In this invisible panopticon, every movement is audited, every breath is a debt to the golden throne, and every dream is a potential heresy. For the king's dynasty, once a proud pillar of the nobility, the walls were closing in. Their influence had rotted. Their rivals were sharpening blades in the dark. Here the sovereign myth takes root. For decades, the king's predecessor, his father, had spent the family's remaining lifeblood and political capital to secure a single ancient document. There was a flicker of what the unrefined might call hope within the family archives. They believed that by securing a warrant of trade, they could restore their honor, save their lineage from the executioner's block, and finally breathe air that did not taste of bureaucratic decay. Imagine the subtle cruelty of this false dawn. The king's father died with a smile on his face, believing that his final act had saved his son. He believed that he had purchased a fiction of liberty for his bloodline. He saw the warrant not as a tool, but as a salvation. It is a profound tragedy to witness a mind convince itself that a more spacious cage is equivalent to a life unchained. Now observe the king as he stands in the echoing cold halls of the Senatorum Imperialis. The ancient scribes, their bodies more machine than flesh, drone their archaic blessings in a language of cold stone. They hand him the warrant, a parchment forged from the skin of extinct beasts, sealed with the blood of an empire. In this moment, the illusion is at its peak. The king feels the weight of the document and, for a fleeting second, he believes the lie. He believes he has won. He believes that for the first time in his life, he owns his own soul. But look closer at the men who gave it to him. The High Lords do not grant autonomy out of benevolence. Their logic is as cold and calculating as the void itself. They looked at the king's dynasty and saw a gear that was beginning to spin out of alignment. They saw a potential threat that was becoming too noisy for the great machine of terror. In their infinite, unfeeling wisdom, they did not choose to crush the gear. They chose to eject it. The Warrant of Trade is the ultimate bureaucratic shackle. By granting him the right to explore the Halo stars, they have effectively orchestrated his exile under the guise of an honor. They have given him his vast armies and his colossal wealth, and they have pointed him toward the most hostile, uncharted regions of the cosmos. If he succeeds, the Imperium expands its border at no cost to itself. If he is obliterated by Xenos horrors in the dark, a problematic and ambitious dynasty has been quietly removed from the political board. The king walks out of the Senatorum, clutching his gilded confinement to his chest. He thinks he is leaving his masters behind, but he is merely becoming their most expensive, self-funded tool of expansion. He boards his flagship with a crown made of paper, oblivious to the fact that his every future move has already been anticipated by a machine that does not know the meaning of the word choice. The false dawn has reached its zenith. The king is about to ignite his engines, sailing away from the only world he has ever known, convinced that he is the master of his own fate. He does not yet understand that the most effective way to control a dangerous man is to convince him that he is finally free. Observe the anatomy of a rogue trader's flagship. It is a catastrophic error of the uninitiated mind to view this vessel merely as a vehicle of exploration or a machine of war. It is not a ship. It is a flying, heavily armored, multi-generational dictatorship. It is a Gothic monolith of dark adamantium, miles in length, carrying a population larger than many planetary capitals. And within the impenetrable hull of this colossal construct, the rogue trader initially attempts to rewrite the rules of existence. Consider the tragedy of his first command. As the ship leaves the Sol system, the king looks down at the hundreds of thousands of void-born serfs laboring in the lightless, sweltering belly of the lower decks. A flicker of virtue, a dangerous, intoxicating false dawn, ignites within his mind. He remembers the cruelty of the High Lords on Terra, and he resolves to be a different kind of ruler. He decrees that rations shall be increased. He abolishes the use of electro-flails in the macro-cannon batteries. He attempts to govern not through terror, but through the enlightened grace of a philosopher king, believing that his fiction of liberty can be shared with those who toil in the dark. But the laws of the universe do not care for philosophy. The grim reality of operating a vessel of such apocalyptic scale quickly crushes his fragile morality. The plasma drives do not run on gratitude. When the ship navigates a treacherous asteroid field and the void shields require immediate manual recalibration in irradiated zones, the king cannot wait for volunteers. He cannot rely on the loyalty of enlightened subjects. The logistics of survival demand instant, unquestioning obedience, and the only reliable currency for obedience is fear. The unforgiving mechanics of reality strike with absolute precision. When a minor mutiny breaks out over water rations, sparked by the very leniency he introduced, the king is faced with a cold mathematical equation. To save the structural integrity of his empire, he must seal the bulkheads of the rioting sector and vent the atmosphere, silently suffocating 3,000 souls in the dark. As he watches them die on his grainy pict screens, he realizes that the heavy machinery of his autonomy is lubricated entirely by blood. He reinstates the electroflails. He cuts the rations back to the minimum required for biological function. He surrounds himself with high-born officers and lethal mercenaries retreating to the gilded command bridge while the lower decks return to their miserable equilibrium. He believes he has escaped the oppression of the High Lords, completely blind to the agonizing irony that he has simply built a perfect, microscopic replica of their tyranny. For one man to walk without chains, 100,000 must be bolted to the floor. His ship is not a beacon of a new era. It is merely a highly mobile, invisible panopticon. As the flagship travels through the established, heavily monitored sectors of the Imperium, the psychological rot within the king accelerates. The scale of his influence distorts his perception of reality. When his colossal vessel enters the orbit of a backwater hive world, planetary governors, men who rule over billions with an iron fist, bow their heads and offer him immediate tribute. The local arbitrators, usually brutal and uncompromising in their enforcement of the Lex Imperialis, avert their eyes when his heavily armed exotic crew wanders their streets. Here another false dawn emerges. The king uses his Warrant of Trade to negotiate a peaceful resolution with a minor, isolated xenospecies, instead of immediately authorizing an orbital bombardment. He sits across from alien diplomats, discussing trade routes and ancient artifacts, He views himself as a paragon of enlightenment, a man who has transcended the blind, dogmatic hatred of the ecclesiarchy. He genuinely believes he is bringing a sophisticated cosmopolitan era of diplomacy to the dark corners of the galaxy, operating on a moral plane far above the ignorant masses of the Imperium. Yet this perceived enlightenment is nothing more than unchecked narcissism. The Xenos do not respect his philosophy. They merely calculate the terrifying yield of his lance batteries and choose compliance over annihilation. The administratum scribes aboard his own ship record this peace not as a diplomatic victory, but as a temporary calculated exploitation of Xenos assets for the Emperor's treasury. His mercy is an illusion, permitted only because it is currently profitable. But the king is already deaf to reason. He breathes the intoxicating, poisonous air of his own expanding myth. He stands alone on his observation deck, surrounded by the silence of the void, watching entire planets shrink into insignificant dots behind his glowing engine trails. He looks at his reflection in the armor glass and deduces that the High Lords are fools playing a small game on a dying world, while he is the only piece on the board capable of true, unrestrained movement. He looks at the archaic Warrant of Trade, proudly displayed in an illuminated stasis vault upon his bridge, and he no longer sees an instrument of bureaucratic exile. He sees a divine mandate. He is completely, irrevocably drunk on his own sovereign myth, unaware that the universe is preparing to test the limits of his sanity. He believes he is a god, orchestrating a grand destiny, entirely ignorant of the fact that the hangover waiting for him in the deep dark will cost him his soul. Consider the ultimate tragedy of the Invisible Tether. The rogue king, standing tall upon his command throne, genuinely believes he is an apex predator soaring far above the restrictive clouds of imperial law. He is completely, tragically blind to the microfilament wire securely fastened to his spine. The sheer scale of the galaxy has played a cruel psychological trick on his perception. Because he cannot physically see the hand holding the leash, he assumes the bureaucratic shackle does not exist. Observe the false dawn of his economy. He conquers savage worlds and strips irradiated moons of their precious ores. He amasses a fortune so staggering that it could buy entire star systems. He looks at his overflowing vaults and believes this wealth guarantees his autonomy. He believes he has built a sovereign kingdom built on his own merit. But every single world he burns and every ounce of promethium he extracts is meticulously recorded. Deep within the sterile, humming cogitator banks of his own logistics department, administratum scribes, loyal first to Terra and second to him, silently tally the imperial tithe. He is accumulating vast wealth, but he is doing so within a financial labyrinth designed, owned, and audited by the High Lords. Then observe the ever-present threat of the Holy Ordos. The king can execute 1,000 serfs with a single whisper. He can hoard forbidden alien artifacts in his private galleries. Yet, beneath his arrogant exterior, there lies a constant, suffocating paranoia. He knows the Inquisition operates in the shadows. He knows that among the hundreds of thousands of souls breathing his recycled air, there are hidden acolytes, a lowly deckhand, a trusted lieutenant, or the concubine sleeping in his quarters could be the eyes of the Ordo Xenos. If he steps 1 inch past the extremely generous boundaries of his warrant, the ancient parchment will not protect his throat from an assassin's blade. This is the brilliant, insidious strategy of the Adeptus Terra. They do not mind his arrogance. In fact, the great machine requires it. Arrogance fuels violent, relentless expansion. They want him to act like a ruthless, untouchable pirate king. Because a man driven by ego will push deeper into the hostile unknown than a man driven merely by duty. They gave him a ridiculously long leash entirely so he could fetch a much heavier prize. He is doing exactly what he was genetically and socially engineered to do. The paradox solidifies into an unbreakable iron ring. A gilded confinement the size of a galactic sector is still fundamentally a confinement. The rogue trader is not a sovereign ruler. He is a highly autonomous, incredibly wealthy employee of the most oppressive regime in human history. To find true liberation, to truly sever the tether, he realizes he must sail into a region of space where the Imperium physically and psychologically ceases to exist. Direct the analytical gaze toward the nature of the mortal mind. It is a mind obsessed with the concept of liberation through permission. The human condition desperately seeks to climb hierarchies, believing that if one simply acquires enough wealth, achieves a high enough rank, or moves far enough away from the center of authority, the unchained illusion will finally become real. Mortal beings chase titles, hoard resources, and accumulate their own tiny, insignificant warrants of trade. They construct borders around their hablocks, their professions, and their bank accounts, declaring these minuscule territories as personal empires. They look down at those trapped beneath them in the hierarchy and feel the exact same intoxicating superiority as the rogue king looking at his lower decks. They build their own invisible panopticons, perfectly content to be prisoners as long as they are permitted to hold the keys to a slightly smaller cell. But logic dictates a cold, unforgiving reality. If liberty requires a signature, whose liberty is it truly? If independence is granted by a governing body, an employer, or a financial institution, then it is not a fundamental right. It is a temporary lease. The system permits the choice of specific labor and the purchase of preferred distractions, but the walls of the labyrinth are strictly maintained by the architect. True sovereignty cannot be bestowed by an authority, because no absolute authority will ever write a contract that leads to its own disadvantage. As long as a mind plays by the rules of the system that created it, it is merely a highly efficient, self-managing asset. The ultimate terrifying paradox of power is mathematically absolute. If the fiction of liberty can be legally documented and politely given by a master, then it can easily and violently be taken back. The rogue king finally understood that the parchment crown was a lie, and so, to cure the rot in his ego, he ordered the navigators to push the massive flagship past the established borders of the Segmentum Obscurus. He ordered them to sail toward the Halo stars, a region of space so profoundly hostile and undocumented that even the Administratum's stellar maps dissolve into blank, black nothingness. As the flagship sailed deeper, the fabric of the environment began to decay. The stars grew incredibly sparse, resembling dying embers in a cold hearth. Deep within the navigator's heavily shielded sanctum, the mutant opened his third eye to read the currents of the immaterium, and he began to scream. The Astronomicon, the glorious golden psychic beacon of terror that guides all human ships, was beginning to flicker. The Emperor's light was turning into violent, meaningless static. Here, the final false dawn presents itself. The king stands on the command bridge, staring into the terrifying, absolute blackness of the uncharted void. The psychic tether snaps. The oppressive, invisible weight of the Imperium of Man, a weight he had carried since the day he was born, evaporates entirely. He feels a euphoric rush of victory. He believes that by crossing this invisible threshold into the unknown, his paper crown has finally transmuted into real, untouchable gold. He has stepped off the board. He is finally untouched. But as the darkness swallows the colossal ship whole, the clinical reality of the universe asserts itself. The threshold was not a doorway to a new, glorious kingdom. The king did not escape into a sanctuary. He merely drove his vessel out of a fortress and directly into a vacuum. A subject ran from a master who demanded everything, only to arrive in a place that demands absolutely nothing. The paradox of his escape is flawlessly executed. He traded the suffocating presence of tyranny for the suffocating presence of the abyss. If your mind remains intact after witnessing this descent, and if you wish to understand the true anatomy of the dark, solidify your anchor now. Subscribe to the archives and leave your philosophical trace in the comments to prove you are not yet a mindless servitor trapped in the lower decks. The king has finally severed his chains. He is entirely untouched by the laws of men, the tithes of the administratum, and the judgment of gods. The sovereign myth is now his reality. But consider the implication of this absolute silence. When a human mind is untethered from consequence and placed into a dark so profound that the very concepts of right and wrong cease to exist entirely, what is the very first atrocity you will permit yourself to commit?